Derrick, how did you come to this painter? How did you find this painter? That was one of my questions. Or is that something you're going to cover in the talk? I don't want to
have a little bit about that at the beginning, although not a lot. So I'm happy to just share some ideas with you to begin with, Jude. You know, I'm an American art historian by training, and Lane is a really critical figure in mid-19th century American art, and I'd long been interested in him. And then it happens that I'm working now at the Timken Museum of Art as their Director of Curatorial Affairs, and they have a small collection of American things, and the painting by Lane is one of the great objects in that collection. But it's curious to me that it's a painting that has not been really well studied by that institution. So I just, as I stopped and looked at it every day and thought about it, I realized that I wanted to expand upon my own knowledge of it and maybe put together this exhibition that once the pandemic is over, I'm going to really return to with full force. So he's a really key figure, and I'm grateful for the chance to think about him, but he's actually always been to the side of my main interests in American art. And now I have this chance to bring him to the center, which excites me.
That's so exciting. And it's so interesting how you're at the Timken now, and that painting is there at the same time,
yeah.
Part of their collection.
It's kind of improbable, really, when you think about it, that this painting ends up in San Diego, so far from you.
Right. Yeah. And just that alone is probably an incredible journey, something to talk about. But yeah, how did that get out there? Or is that something you're going to cover in your talk?
That's the talk.
Okay, I won't ask you anymore. I won't ask you anymore.
It is an interesting story, and I think, you know, Lane, like many American artists of his generation, has had peaks of interest in his lifetime, and then there was a period of time when there may have been less interest in him as a painter, but certainly today he's one of the key artists that people in my field think about. And so it's a great thing for San Diego that they have such an important work by him, but I would guess if the same circumstances existed today where the museum was offered the painting, they couldn't afford it. It's just in a different sphere of acquisition.
Yeah, it's did he ever visit California?
No, although the painting, one of my points in this presentation is the painting likely came to California before, in the 19th century, before we might have expected it to, and then went back to Castine at a later point.
Oh, that's even more fascinating. So it's kind of been around.
Yeah, it's more than you would expect for a painting that's so local in terms of its references. It's a painting that has had a lot of, well, biography to it.
I don't know that much about, I'm really looking forward to your talk because I don't know that much about Lane and that whole era actually in American painting is really fascinating. And the only real part that I do know is from my very basic teaching of like an introductory art class, where I spoke about, or I introduced students to the topic of itinerant painters. That during that period, the early American period, there were people that traveled and painted, and oftentimes had similar backgrounds and bodies, but then the painter painted in the head and the fingers and jewelry, different things to make it more personal.
Right. Good for you. That was a really important practice, and it's little known, but Lane did a couple of portraits. He's, you know, famous for his seascapes and his marine paintings, but he did actually, at least there are records of 2 or 3 of them that I've seen.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because I wondered if he was part of that genre of, you know, even just to make a living. Some painters were, you know, itinerant. That's what they did, or they painted murals inside homes. Yeah. But I didn't know if he was in that strata of artists, or if he was more, you know, more self-supporting, or able to paint basically what he wanted, or what he was
Yeah, such a good question, Jude, because I think Lane is certainly living at a moment or born into a situation where that kind of limner, itinerant practice of painting was going on, especially in New England and places like that. But he's also part of a generation that begins to look at other ways of making a living as an artist. So he um, really is not formally trained. He goes to lithographic studios, publishing houses, and he learns how to copy other artists' work. And from that, he derives a lot of his skill and his draftsmanship from that experience. But he, like many people, including those limners that you mentioned, he's not an artist who went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris to get his training. And even somebody like Winslow Homer, who had experience, I'm thinking about the painting behind you on your screen. Even Homer is somebody who has the experience of going to France, and studying with the Barbizon painters and coming back. That informs what he does.
Yeah, so that I didn't realize he was self-taught.
I wouldn't say strictly speaking self-taught, but not a formal art school training that you would maybe expect an artist of the next generation to have had. And he's sort of a local boy, right? He spends most of his life in Gloucester, and his key point of reference, part of the talk, will be to show why Castine was such an important place, not just to Lane, but particularly to Lane at this moment that he starts painting it.
Did it have something to do with shipbuilding?
Yeah, I think so.
I won't have to, you don't have to go on. I'm curious because of course the Maine Maritime Academy is there now, has a long tradition.
I don't think it was there when Lane was there, but it was certainly a big, you know this probably better than me, Jude, a big manufacturing center for ships. And it was a very active port. It was prosperous in a way. And so he's drawn there for some other reasons too, but certainly the commercial strength of Castine as a port town was a big part of it. It was hard for him to get there, and I'll say this in the talk too. Lane from childhood had a disability that made it very difficult for him to walk. In fact, he walked with crutches most of the time. And so in some ways, traveling to a place, as hard to get to as Castine was its own challenge, except traveling by water and being part of that whole maritime economy facilitated his access to a place, even though it probably took him the better part of the day and maybe a little bit longer to get from Gloucester to Castine. It was certainly easier to be on the water for someone like Lane than it would have been to travel overland.
Yes, and that was the entire state of Maine was all, there were no highways or roads. It was all, well, they were paths. They were much less, there was much more transportation by water. Everything was delivered by water. People traveled by water. Yeah, so many communities along the coast could be, were shipbuilding communities from the very end of the seaboard up in Washington County, right down to Portsmouth, Portland, Boston, and beyond. I mean, they were all building ships and traveling. And I think what was significant for Maine was that it was closer to like the North Atlantic trade routes. So that also helped with all of the building of the shipping industry here.
Right. It was essential really to the commercial success of the region. We forget that now as we jump into our cars to visit Maine in the summertime, that there was a better way to get there.
Yeah, and then there was steamship. When sailing started there was that transitional period where there was the steamers. and that was really, I think, significant in bringing rusticators, what the locals called rusticators, or actually it was a phenomenon, rusticating, coming to Maine and resting. So the steamers, many of the steamers brought people here in that, I think that was late 19th century, early 20th.
Even earlier, Lane overlaps a little bit with that. In fact, when we look at one of the pictures that's at your museum, there's a steamship very prominently placed off Owl's Head. And I think Lane is trying to acknowledge the fact that there's this new commerce, this new traffic coming there. But in the Castine picture, there's none of that. So I'm interested in his choices about which vessels to put in which pictures and how to signal Maine's different economies. And I think you're absolutely right. By the late 19th century, it's really the steamship and facilitating that, I would say, touristic travel, but I love the term rusticator since I've been one myself. And I think Lane is keen to show us that in these works.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, I can't wait to listen. And it looks like people are rolling in. I just want to acknowledge that yes, we have quite a few folks coming in, and please use the Q&A box if you have any questions at all that you'd like to ask Dr. Cartwright, and we'll be getting started in just another 5 minutes. So welcome everyone. Yeah, that was such an interesting time in American history, that late 20th century, especially in painting, that because, well, from my point of view, limited as it is, but people, so many Americans were looking to Europe to be trained, and so many painters, and then of course the Impressionists, and such a group of heretics they were, and how they then influenced the American painters. I'm thinking about J. Alden Weir and in Connecticut, and Childe Hassam and others that were influenced by the Impressionists, and then how that kind of morphed into something else completely American. So it kind of, in some ways, I think we take for granted the painters that were earlier, because, we're looking at modern, we're looking at American modern, most of us are anyway. And so many of the paintings from that earlier period are either itinerant, or they're more local, or more, there's not a specific genre, I guess, that, or maybe I'm all wrong on this, but it's mostly place related rather than artistic, more of the artistic expression of the painter.
Right. Well, certainly if you're thinking about groups like the Hudson River School and their attachment to place, Lane sort of is coexisting with those artists, except on the, mid-coast Maine landscape. And so he's certainly familiar with Frederick Edwin Church and others, and conversant with what they're doing. He's seeing their works in exhibitions, but he's taking his own path. So he's an interesting bridge figure to that later moment that you're talking about, that more impressionist post-Civil War period. Lane dies in, I think, 1865. So he's not part of that really flourishing Gilded Age art world that comes to define American art practice in the last decades of the 19th century and into the 20th century. He's cut off from that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cartwright. I don't mean to.
No, please call me.
Enlist you, too much, with revealing too much of your talk, but it's really been fascinating speaking with you, and we'll be getting started in just 2 minutes.
Great.
So I wanted to just welcome everyone coming in from all over the country. We had over 130 people sign up for your talk, and then I've been taking calls here right up until we got on Zoom at 1:30 with folks that were still looking to get on. So so I'm very excited to have you be here today, and thank you again for making time.
Me too.
To join us. Yeah, and there's, I want to also thank my colleague, David Troop, who's in the background monitoring the chat or actually the Q&A. And someone is here from the Castine Historical Society, which is great. So
great.
Welcome.
Great. Well, they'll have better answers than me for some of these questions if we have them.
So I want to welcome everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes, actually 1 minute. And if you have questions for Dr. Cartwright, please put them in the Q&A. The chat is disabled, and we're sending folks to the Q&A because that'll help us keep better track of all the questions. And we'll be able to answer questions at the end of his program. So it's just 2 o'clock now. And my phone is ringing. I'm not gonna pay any attention to it. I think it will stop as it, I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now. It will roll over, I'm sure. So welcome everyone. I wanna thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jude Valentine, and I'm the coordinator of studio and public programs here at the Farnsworth Art Museum, located in beautiful Midcoast, Maine. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all, and especially I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of the members and patrons of the Timken Museum. Thank you all for joining us today for our program, Fitz Henry Lane, from Castine to San Diego, California, with Dr. Derrick Cartwright. And I also want to take a moment and thank Jane Rice for all of her work on the other side of the country to help us get this lecture going. She's with the Timken. And it's my honor now to introduce Dr. Cartwright. Dr. Derrick Cartwright is an associate professor of art history in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History at the University of San Diego. He's also the director of University Galleries at USD and the director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum of Art. Dr. Cartwright has lectured throughout the world and published on a wide variety of American and transatlantic cultural exchange topics. His previous museum experience includes directional service at the Musée d'Art Américain Giverny, at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, San Diego Museum of Art, and Seattle Art Museum. Recent publications include Robert Henri's California, Realism, Race, and Region, 1914 to 1925, that was published in 2014, and D.Y. Cameron, Mystic Beauty and Sacred Space, that was published in 2018. Dr. Cartwright's exhibition, Fitz Henry Lane in Castine, Maine, is scheduled to take place during the fall of 2023 at the Timken Museum of Art. And now it's my honor to introduce and turn the program over to Dr. Derrick Cartwright.
Thank you. So the first thing I want to do is give you all a better view. Whoops. Okay, I'm hoping that is now filling your screen. And I want to begin just by saying thanks to Jude Valentine for this invitation to speak, and also to David Troop for handling all the logistical details with this presentation. It's really a pleasure to collaborate with colleagues at the Farnsworth and to be in a dialogue with this audience. So I hope in the question and answer session, we can have a really active exchange. As I was preparing this, I was remembering that my wife has a big part of her family in Maine, and as a result, I've been lucky to visit your museum, the Farnsworth, on numerous occasions, and I've always admired it. So it's really an honor for me to be here with you. In some fundamental way, I also realized in talking with Lauren that this talk sort of begins with an experience I had with her family climbing to the top of Mount Batty near Camden and looking out over Penobscot Bay and thinking about the beauty of this region and how it worked in the past. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking about Claire and Steve Hirsch as I deliver this talk because I'm so indebted to them. So I'm going to go quickly, and I'm not going to read this talk. I hope that's all right. I'm going to really talk about the images. I've got a lot of them. But I realized that speaking about Fitzhenry Lane to an audience in Farnsworth, Maine, is a little bit like the proverbial carrying coals to Newcastle, or maybe, carrying lobster rolls in your region to Newcastle, Maine. It's something you already have in abundance, and it would be better if I brought fish tacos or something like that from San Diego, because you already are so steeped in Lane. And I think especially of the paintings that the Farnsworth is so lucky to have, like this view of Owl's Head Light, which is part of this moment that I'm going to be thinking about with you today. And you've already had such substantial contributions to research on this. I'm a huge admirer of the work that Michael Komanecki and June Bianco did on this beautiful publication that just came out from the Farnsworth, in which Voss Prabhu was nice enough to send me in advance of this talk. I couldn't admire it more, but I realize that raises the stakes for trying to say something new about Lane. So forgive me if I get some of the complex coastal geography of Maine wrong in this talk. I have a few other caveats too before I get started. There's just a lot of good work on Fitzhenry Lane, and even the Farnsworth has been a part of the generation of that scholarship. Back in, I think it was 1974, there was a major exhibition of Lane's work at the Farnsworth Museum, and about 45 works, some of which I'm going to show you today, were part of that exhibition. And additionally, there is just a really important bibliography for people in my field that already exists about Fitzhenry Lane. And I'm just giving you a very short and selected bibliography of this, which includes the really important contributions of someone like John Wilmerding, and more recently the work of Georgia Barnhill and Melissa Trafton at the Cape Ann Museum, which had this fantastic exhibition of Lane's lithography, which I'll mention at a couple of points. But I'm really excited, and you should be too, about the forthcoming publication of Margaretta Lovell's research, which will appear, I think, next year under the title Painting the Inhabited Landscape, Fitzhenry Lane and the Global Reach of Antebellum New England. Professor Lovell, who teaches at UC Berkeley, was nice enough to share with me her manuscript for that. I'm going to try as much as possible not to steal her thunder in this talk and present my ideas, but I just highly recommend that volume to you when it appears next year, because it goes so far deeper than anything I could offer today. I also just want to mention that Lane is really fortunate to have this incredible online catalog, and questions that I can't answer today for this audience will likely be answered on fitzhenrylaneonline.org, which includes this comprehensive catalog raisonné of Lane's work. And I'm just showing you the page that relates to Castine on that website, including, again, some of the Farnsworth's pictures. I think that Lane is lucky as an artist to have this much material devoted to him, scholarship devoted to him, and he's certainly a kind of saint to the people of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where he lived most of his life, showing you the statue that sits outside of the house that he built there, which was erected in, the statue was placed in 1996. So Lane is somebody that we should know a lot about, and it raises the bar, as I say, to say something new about him. I'm going to presume that some of you have biography about Lane already in your toolkits, but just in case you don't, I want to give you a quick biographical sketch of his life. He was born Nathaniel Rogers Lane. There's a lot of issues with his naming, which we may talk about in the question and answer session, but that was his given name at birth. He was the second of 4 children to Jonathan and Sarah Lane. His father was a sailmaker. And Jude and I were talking beforehand, he didn't actually have formal artistic training in the sense of going to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts or the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He gets apprenticed to actually a couple of different lithography shops, and by 1832, so in his late 20s, he's installed in Boston working for William Pendleton, who was one of the leading lithographers of that era. And it's in that context, that sort of industrial working context of being an artist, that Lane gets his precision and his draftsmanship, I think. He works independently for a while and then returns to his family home in Gloucester, and maybe makes his first trip to Maine in 1848. But it wouldn't be his last. Lane goes repeatedly to Maine over the next decade, and most of the time he's stopping in Castine, which is my main subject today. So this is the painting that I get to look at when I'm blessed with some spare time at the Timken, and which has really prompted me to think about this talk with the Farnsworth today. It's a painting done in 1851 during one of those visits to Maine, called Castine Harbor and Town. And it's always struck me as just this really beautiful, peaceful image that I wanted to understand better. And so thank you again to Jude for giving me this chance to think about it. I think that Lane is an artist who is thinking about place, and Castine was clearly a place that mattered to him. But I also want to think about this object in terms of its travels throughout the world. And again, I'm going to refer back to my colleague Margaretta Lowell, who sort of poses this idea of part of art history could be object biographies. And Lowell's written, the object biography asks longitudinal questions, deprivileging both the point of origin and the position of the present in the interest of an open-ended narrative of descent and change. So I want to think about this painting in terms of its trajectory over time, where it's been. Clearly, it has a point of reference to Castine, Maine, and I want to talk about that. But where it's been since then and how it got to a place like San Diego is actually a question, I think, not of small consequence, but actually of larger consequences, and just as interesting to me as I try to offer you as an audience something new. When we think about Lane, many of us, certainly as I was taught him, I was thinking about these really beautiful, poetic pictures of places like Penobscot Bay. This is one of the larger paintings Lane did. It's called Lumber Schooners at Evening on Penobscot Bay from about 1863, so a decade later than the period that I'm talking about. And I think for audiences going to museums today, they often stand in front of these works and with terminology that they've been given by scholars, think about them as these luminous appreciations of light and atmosphere and calm, when in fact, I think there's another way to look at these paintings, and I think Margaretta does this so well in her book, as representations of power, of commercial power, of industrial power, of the power of New England at this time. And certainly that's another way to wrestle with Lane. And so I want to complicate him a little bit in this talk and share with you some of my perspectives on how we could make sense of Lane's movements between aesthetic positions in these paintings. And the place that he has chosen to work on, or that I've chosen to focus on, is this place, Castine, Maine, which many of you know better than me. But I'm showing you a late 19th century map of the town of Castine, Maine, which was quite prosperous, had a lot of industry around the shipping business, and its small port was one of the most important ones in the early 19th century. And I'm also showing you a lithograph in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It's actually a view of Castine from across the water near, I think, what's called Hospital Island, and was a challenge to Lane. Actually, one of his friends, and I'll talk about this later, was dissatisfied with this view of his town and challenged Lane to come up with a better view. And I'll show you that view in a few moments. But Castine is a place that, unless you are in mid-coast Maine, you may not know about, but certainly played a very important role in the middle of the 19th century. I read in one account that it was the second highest per capita standard of living in the United States was actually in Maine. So why is that? In Castine, Maine. Why is that? It's because of this prospering shipbuilding industry. It's because of the kind of people who've settled onto this little peninsula sticking out into the northeast corner of the Penobscot Bay. And Lane is invited into this area from his home in Gloucester, and he thrives there, which is important. I think it has this long, durable history, which Jude gave me a new term for, this sort of rusticating spot where people could go to recuperate from the hard life of the city in places of like Castine. And I think in the late 19th century, it plays that function, but that's not the Castine that Lane himself was most interested in, or that drew him there in the first place. Yes, it becomes that, and I'll talk about that as we go on in the object biography of the Timken's painting. But Lane was part of this earlier moment and observing its growth as an industrial hub. And I think there are a lot of examples of artists coming to places in Maine and trying to depict their prosperity. I was struck last week at an auction in New York City, this view of Hallowell, Maine, which I think is a little south of Augusta, sold for a multiple of its estimates. You know, it's a kind of charming view of a kind that I'm sure Lane would have disapproved of in terms of its, you know, the quality of draftsmanship and painting. But I think his work also participates in this kind of placemaking, a kind of description of places that then were held in honor by various people. And certainly Castine is not unique. There are a number of villages, and you know them better than me, scattered throughout Maine that have been painted in this way. But I guess I want to suggest at the very beginning that Castine was a difficult subject for a painter like Lane to paint. On the one hand, we should know that Lane from childhood had a disability that made his own personal mobility very challenging for him. He walked with crutches throughout his adult life, and getting to a place like Castine was not an easy thing to do, actually made much easier by traffic via the waterways. There weren't roadways that could get you there. And so Maine was easily accessed from, if not Gloucester directly, then from Boston to a place like Portland, and then by a series of smaller ships could land you in, I think, Belfast, and then very shortly after that in Castine, maybe even in the course of a day, but probably more than one day. And Lane picks this place and pursues it for a number of years. And so I want to at least develop with you this idea that there's a kind of lack of ease to this access, but that's erased in the pictures that he makes there. That he, to quote Frederick Scharf, who wrote this nice text about him and his excursions in Maine, Lane mastered these problems, the difficulties of getting there with great skill. He mastered the landscape, which is spread out and also in its own way difficult to access, and he concentrates it into a picture like the one that's now in San Diego. And I think we have to seize that idea as we appreciate his effort. I'm thinking about this picture in terms of how it relates to a small family of objects that live in San Diego now at the Timken Museum of Art. And as I think I said, you know, when I'm lucky enough not to be consumed with some other meeting, I get to walk into these galleries and think about the relationships, how this painting sits next to a view of Nantucket by Eastman Johnson, or a great portrait by John Singleton Copley of Margaret Kemble Gage, and think about the way they tell the story of American art. One of the things that we forget is that it's not an easy thing, or it's not something that we should just assume happens, that a painting like the one we're going to talk about today ends up in a place like San Diego. In fact, it's hard, okay? This is to just demonstrate a point which I think is probably already clear to people. Castine is about as far away from San Diego, California as you can get on a map of the continental United States. That it would take quite a long time for it to get there. Yet one of my points is this painting has traveled back and forth across this country on multiple occasions, even in the 19th century, and that we need to fix that into our calculus of its meanings and the way it's been interpreted over time. But let's hope that the next time I get to Castine, I don't have to do this drive. For most of its life, the painting has lived in two places, and I'm showing you them here on the screen. And what I want to trace with you is, in part, how they traveled between these two places. I'm showing you on the left the Witherlee Memorial Library, which was constructed in Maine, in Castine, Maine, around 1912. And since 1986, it's been in the Timken Museum of Art, the facade of which I'm showing you here. So without belaboring this, these are two public serving institutions separated by a continent, but this painting functions beautifully within them both. And now I want to look a little bit at Lane's practice and show you these drawings, these really meticulous drawings that he did of Castine from multiple perspectives. So this is a view of Castine from Watson's Hill in Brooksville, done in August 1850, so about a year before the painting I was just talking about. Excuse me, that I was just talking about. I'm interested in the way that Lane repeatedly in these sketches pieces together different sheets. It's been speculated by some scholars that he may have used a device like a camera obscura or a camera lucida to make these transcriptions, these topographical transcriptions of the landscape. If so, I don't think that's any discredit to the objects themselves, but I'm struck by this view down across the bay towards, I think, what you see in the center. Let's see if my cursor will pop it up. That's the town of Castine, the peninsula on which it sits. And then Lane tells us a little bit about the manufacture of this work too by these inscriptions, which date it very precisely, give him credit as the delineator, the draftsperson, but also bears three signatures. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. One is F.H. Lane, the other is Joseph L. Stevens, and then Joseph L. Stevens Jr., and they were his hosts in Castine, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But the fact that they almost share authorship for the creation of this work is borne out in the letters that the Stevenses wrote about Lane's time in Castine and how they facilitated his travels throughout the region so he could produce these multiple views of the town itself. This is Joseph Lowe Stevens Jr. in a photograph taken about 10 years after Lane's death. And he very early on gives us records of Lane's travels and also other artists' travels to Maine, mostly to Mount Desert Island. But he records in 1850 that Lane, who was with him, with his family, he means, made good additions to his portfolio. And so what's Lane doing in 1850 in Castine, besides doing these meticulous drawings of both the landscape and in some cases, the homes of the Stevens family members? He's painting these highly poetic, almost romantic landscapes of excursions through the waterways. These are two paintings, sort of, I think they need to be thought of as companion pieces to one another, and they almost, like the work of Washington Alston, romanticize these excursions of men and women going out on a summer's day to recreate and to have fishing parties and walk hand in hand on the beach. It's a kind of you could almost say wish fulfillment on Lane's part to paint these works. And so he's interested in that, but that's ultimately, I would say, a small part of what he does when he's in this region. He's doing some services for his hosts. So in this case, I'm showing you one of several watercolors that Lane did of the Stevens family homestead. And then a photograph on the right with the Stevens family members, or several of them standing outside of that, from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, which shows this is the context in which Lane settled in 1850 and repeatedly came back to 1851, 1853, 1855, 1856. And so he's interested in making these images of the town, which, as you can see, was very well equipped. And he's also interested in the history of the place. So he's going up to Fort George, which was a military complex, British military installation. And he's drawing the fortifications, but he's also drawing the view that that provides back down over the town of Castine itself. And so again, I'm interested in the matching of these multi-sheet drawings with these panoramic landscapes that Lane produces. And he's getting to know this place, because I think it's fair to say that Lane found a new family almost in the Stevenses in Castine. And he's, the correspondence shows this, that he's deeply indebted to them, and they are to him, for this sort of exchange of art and ideas that they shared with one another every summer. In 1855, Lane works with Joseph Stevens Jr. to produce a replacement for that lithograph that I showed you earlier that Stevens was so dissatisfied with. Stevens comes up with this scheme really to produce a new lithographic topographical view of Castine, and Lane obliges. And so you have this, again, panoramic, very detailed view of the town of Castine. I'm showing you the prospectus for that lithograph, which now exists in multiple public collections. It's showing you a hand-colored version of it on the right. It cost $2 in 1855 to subscribe and get this print. And I think the fact that it was fully subscribed tells you something, at least a little bit, about the appeal of these works for not just people who lived in Castine, but for a broader audience interested in American life at this time. I don't really have enough time today to go into it in detail, but I'm inclined to believe that these images are not completely neutral, realist representations, that Lane is, like all of us, interested in places that he knows. And so he's very careful, at least in his drawing. And you can see it here in those 2 stars I've put on this slide, in mapping the place that he was staying. So that's Stevens's house. And then he's making sure to carve out that place within the landscape of the lithograph on the right. But he's also, in this way, reimagining Castine to suit his own needs. And so returning again to the painting in San Diego, and this is this view, and I'm interested in what Lane does to manufacture this image, to make it meaningful to him. And to do this, I think we need to just refer to another sketch. So this is the MFA Boston's really beautiful watercolor sketch of Castine Harbor and Town from Hospital Island, looking, I think, back across. It may actually not be Hospital Island. I may be mistaken about that. But in any case, it's a view across the water toward the town itself. It has this really interesting inscription, which I'll just make easy for you to read. And it's a puzzling inscription. I'm not quite sure. It looks like it could be Stevens's hand, although I'm not sure about that. Stevens was Lane's executor of his estate, and it's possible there are a couple of infelicities in this that I'm not clear on. But anyway, the inscription reads, "Castine Harbor and Town from the American Battery of 1779 at Haney's Point." Fitzhenry, I think it's Lane, but it's been transcribed as Land, of Gloucester, Mass, made this sketch for Noah Brooks in 1851, and on its acceptance, an oil painting. In his will of November 1900, Mr. Brooks bequeathed the painting to the town of Castine for the public library. So embedded in this is some sense that this is a much later inscription, therefore it's, done presumably after Brooks's death, but I want to chase that just for a minute. Before I do that, I just want to show you some of the changes that Lane introduced when he made this work before finishing the painting for Brooks. So this is something that PowerPoint lets us do. You can overlay these images and you see their relative relationship to one another. And in taking the watercolor and comparing it to the Timken's painting, you can see that Lane actually expands the panorama quite a bit. He sort of shifts the view, which I think is toward Camden Hills to the north and west, and sort of troubles himself to make good on these relationships of the houses. He's paying very careful attention to the colors of the buildings themselves. And most importantly for me, he's replacing the lone ship in the watercolor with this array of, I think I've counted them, over 12 boats in this basin of water before the town of Castine. And so he's thinking about how he can personalize this view. And I say personalize, maybe he'll make it biographically referential. So take a look, for instance, at these two details of the Timken's picture, which show these three-masted ships, big commercial vessels, maybe even the same ship, although I'm not enough of an expert to say this, but repeats them in the composition. These are boats that are made in the same year as this boat was made in Castine, called the William H. Witherlee in 1851. And again, I'm not going to press this point, but I think there's a case to be made that Lane is painting a portrait of this. And you'll see why that might be important in a minute. But he's tucking it into the background of his generalized view of Castine. And he's also putting in these other boats as well. So this is a small craft that Lane draws of the Stevens family boat. It's the boat that he and Joseph Stevens would have taken around on their excursions throughout the region to go paint in Brooksville and Camden and other places. And it appears, I think, or something very like it appears in the Castine Harbor and Town picture in the lower right corner as well, with two figures, right? These friends out for a day. And I think Lane, in some case, it may be a stretch, but bear with me, I think he's projecting himself into this landscape, into this highly personal way. The first owner of the painting, and we know this from the MFA inscription, is this fellow, Noah Brooks. We may not recognize him today, but he's best known for being the author of a multi-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln, and was an important journalist and wrote a lot of juvenile fiction in the late 19th century. He was also born in Castine, Maine. In fact, used Castine as his pseudonym in the newspaper articles that he wrote in California and other places. So Noah Brooks, here on the left, at the age of 21, commissions Fitz Henry Lane to paint this work and then takes it with him to Illinois, Kansas, Sacramento, the Gold Country, back to Massachusetts, to ultimately to Castine, where he lives his last decade of his life before he moves back. He had respiratory problems and moved back to Pasadena for the very end of his life, but determines to give the painting to the public library in Castine. Castine has one of the oldest library collections in all of Maine, I think the second oldest. And so Brooks is thinking about the place of this painting, not just for himself, but for the community which inspired it. And I think that's an interesting fact to keep in mind. This is Brooks, who wrote, especially in his last years, these stories about life on the coast of Maine for young audiences, young readers. And he's pretty interested in the social dynamics of the place. And I'm just giving you a long citation from one of those essays that he wrote for Century Magazine. And there he is sitting in his library, surrounded by portraits of Lincoln and other figures. And I'll just give it away. There's our painting sitting there above the fireplace. It's important to know that Brooks himself was an artist, and he trained as an artist first. May have not been so successful, but it's possible that, you know, his desire to have this memory, this talismanic object with him throughout his career as a journalist, owes something to his appreciation for fine art making. It's a painting that an artist would love. And there's the library itself, with, again, prominently placed the Timken's picture above the fireplace, along with these other clearly personal tokens of remembrance that Brooks has kept with him, like this image of Lincoln. Sorry. So when Brooks dies, or knows that he is about to die, he makes it clear that he wants the painting given to the public library in Castine. So he arranges for the Witherlee Memorial Library. So you remember that name, Witherlee, which was at this point did not exist. I think it was the town hall of Castine was on the site, but the Witherlee family gave funds to build a brand new Carnegie-like library on this space. They were the chandlers for the shipping industry in the town. They were an immensely important family. I'm showing you on the right, George Witherlee, who's like Lane, this intrepid figure climbing Mount Katahdin in his 60s, and reaching the top, being photographed there. He's part of this community-spirited movement within Castine that wants to have a new public library at the turn of the century, as so many other communities did. And in it, he's imagining that Brooks's painting collection would go on view there. And so I'm showing you on the left a portrait of Brooks done late in life, a portrait of the presumed founder of Castine, Maine, that's the Baron de Castine, painted by Will Hickok Lowe, who was an important American artist, but he actually, I'm tempted to say that he's painting Castine as if he's George Witherlee, right? It's this interest in, you know, reinscribing contemporary history into the past. And then, of course, the two paintings of Castine, one from the water, one from Fort George, that Brooks himself owned. And for many, many years, these paintings stood in the library at Castine, Maine, and Witherlee Memorial Library, and were shown there till about 1978. I'll get to that in a minute, but I just want to make a brief detour to mention that Castine has long been this magnet for literary figures. Mary McCarthy lived there, Philip Booth lived there, and one of the important people who lived there as well was Robert Lowell, the American poet, who in his lifetime produced over 20 volumes of poetry from about 1956 until his death in 1977. Lowell was, like Lane, summering in Castine, and he couldn't have avoided the painting that hung in the Witherlee Library. I'm showing you this walking map of Castine, and that's the house that Lowell and his wife, Elizabeth Hardwick, inherited from his cousin, Harriet Winslow, and next to it is the Witherlee Library. So it was always there for him to consider, and I'll say in a moment why I think that this is important. Lowell actually had this habit of working on poems, wrote dozens of poems about his experience in Maine, but wrote specifically about Castine and wrote specifically about Fitz Henry Lane's paintings in Castine and in a couple of different poems. And he reworked these poems. So sometimes there's repetition in them, but in Castine, 1860, we're just going to read this quickly for you. One misses Emerson, drowned in luminism, his vast serenity of emptiness, and Fitzhugh Lane painting a ship moored in Castine within shouting distance of my barn in 1860. Its bright fly wings fixed in the topographical severity of a world reworked as glass. He goes back to this painting again, or sorry, to the painting, and I think also to his poem again about 3 years later, and he reworks it as he often did. He's changed that ship to a schooner, but he's still thinking in terms of this imagery fixed, reworked and fixed severely into this almost perfected environment. So I think Lowell, who is, you know, an artist himself, a poet who is interested in understanding the representational terms that are offered to him by being in Maine first and foremost, but also by representations of it like Lane's, is moved by this painting. And Lowell is a guy who thinks about paintings all the time. And this is, I need to hurry to a conclusion about this, but this is the painting that Lowell had in his arms when he died in a taxi cab in New York City on his way back from London to meet with his wife, who he had separated from, Elizabeth Hardwick. It's a portrait by the British-German painter Lucian Freud of Freud's second wife, Lady Caroline Blackwood, who was also married to Lowell. And so it's an image of, I would say, severity reworked. And it was one of the reasons why the paintings of Freud at this period were so critiqued, was their severity, their unfriendliness towards their subject matter to some degree. And Lowell had a deep appreciation for this. And I think he found it again in his proximity to Lane. So the last part of this talk is, I'm going to race through it, but it's actually the most obscure part of this object's biography. The painting was sold by the Castine Library, the Witherlee Memorial Library Board, and it appeared in the New York art market around 1978, 1979. And then it disappeared into a private hand. It showed up again in 1983 at what many of you will recognize as the grand opening of the IMPA building at the Portland Museum of Art. There it is, just trust me, on the wall of this display in that newly opened building. And then it disappears again. And the Timken at several points had expressed an interest in this painting from the various New York dealers who were offering it to them. And so how does it get there? I think this is a point where I just wanted to draw a comparison between the Timken's history and your own history at the Farnsworth. Like Lucy Farnsworth, the Timken was formed by extraordinary women. And I'm showing you Amy, Irene, and Ann Putnam, who were fortunate enough to inherit a large fortune in the same way that Lucy Farnsworth did. They were determined, even though they lived fairly private lives, they were determined to do something for their community. And in the end, they produced San Diego's only always free art museum with a world-class art collection to go with it. And so in 1965, actually after all of their deaths, the Timken Museum of Art opened to the public, full of art of mostly old masters, but by, let's see, By 1981, the Timken board had decided they wanted to expand upon the Putnams' somewhat limited collecting interest to include great American paintings. And on their hit list, I'm just showing you this quote from a letter that I found in the curatorial files. Among their top searched for objects was a luminous landscape by Fitz Henry Lane, which in fact they acquired in 1986. The painting almost immediately left again to go to an exhibition organized by John Wilmerding at the National Gallery of Art, this major Fitz Henry Lane exhibition, where it joined other paintings, its brothers and sisters from this period, like the Lighthouse at Camden, Maine, which is at Yale, and was shown as really this moment where Lane gets his largest national audience to this point. And Wilmerding had ranked the painting among Lane's finest works. And so it gets this big public reintroduction after a period of time when it had been invisible. And now I'm thinking about bringing these groups of things back together again. And I think that's a really challenging thing to do, especially in the middle of a pandemic like this one. But I think it would be really interesting, since the National Gallery of Art and other institutions have already done big Lane shows, to just gather together a small group of works and think about their separate biographies, the way in which they've traveled, and to introduce a new chapter to them. So this is just an example of the kind of thing I'm hoping to work on, again, with the help of Professor Lowell in the near future. I think these pictures, now I'm showing you this detail of the center of the Timken's picture. These pictures are about sociability in a way. I'm struck by the fact that Lane goes to some lengths to show us that there are men and women in these pleasure crafts as opposed to the sort of skilled solitary sailors on this other vessel, and that he's interested in marking the places that he knows really well, but that these works also had a social life that was important and enduring and can move us today is what most motivates me with this project. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share now.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cartwright. That was just amazing. The connections that you've been putting together and the backstory. It's just, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. This is just an amazing, amazing. I'm looking forward to the exhibit and more of your research. And we've had a few questions, especially there's a couple of questions about the name. Is it Fritz or Fitz? And is there a hue in the middle? Is there anything you can add or shed some light on that?
So that's a really smart question. The Lane naming is a bit of a challenge. As I mentioned, he was born where certain Nathaniel Rogers Lane, but changed the name shortly after that. It's been speculated there was another artist named Nathaniel Rogers, and that may have been part of the thinking, although I'm not totally convinced by that argument. And then you'll notice, maybe you didn't, but in the paintings, it's often signed F.H. Lane. And until the early 20th, or actually at some point in the early 20th century, someone interpreted that as his name was Fitzhugh Lane, which is not apparently correct. His legal documents have been recovered that show that he went by Fitz Henry Lane. But if you were educated during the time that I was, you know him as Fitzhugh Lane. And it's only with some effort that I can correct myself every time I say the name to remember that it's Fitzhenry. And I think other people have nicely skirted this issue by just sort of saying Fitz H. Lane, because that's the certain part.
Thank you for
funny naming problem. It's not unique, but I think it makes doing research on him sometimes funny. And that watercolor that's at the MFA Boston actually says Fitzhenry Lane on it. So that itself tells you that at some point around the turn of the century, people were aware of what the name was.
Thank you for clarifying. I think that'll help a lot of folks here. And there's a question about his contemporaries. Who were his contemporaries around the world? Who were his contemporaries doing marine landscapes or other marine artists while he was his contemporaries, right?
I think before when we were talking, Jude, we talked a little bit about the other artists who would have been, on the minds of Americans at this time, people like Frederick Edwin Church, who certainly goes up to Mount Desert Island and does some of the same imagery that Lane does. There are British artist named Robert Salmon who's working in the United States at this time. And so he's a contemporary, maybe roughly a contemporary of Lane's. But Lane is the artist, if you are going to commit yourself to studying American art and you want to think about the great maritime traditions in the 19th century, Lane is the figure, even though he did have some partners.
I'm going to kind of keep going here with questions.
I was going to just jump in, Jude.
Yes.
There's also another complicating factor in Lane's scholarship is Lane had a student, Mary Blood Mellon, who often worked with him to finish some paintings, and she was doing some of these same subjects as well. And she's become an artist worthy of investigation in her own right, although there's often some debate about who the author of certain paintings ascribed to Lane might be, because she worked in a manner so indebted to him.
That's fascinating. That sounds like a whole other topic. Oh my gosh, wow. Where was the artist situated when he painted the sailing vessels in harbor or around Castine?
So that I can tell you, but it may be easier for me to tell you that on the Fitzhenry Lane online site, there's a a dedicated effort to determine the viewpoint from which each of these images has been created. And there's a scholar, I think his name is Derrick R, who's done a fantastic job of plotting exactly. So I can tell you roughly, you know, he's across on this Haney's Point, looking back towards Castine. When he paints the Timken's picture, we know this from the watercolor, but he takes out that foreground entirely from the island and makes it appear as if he's in a boat with his, presumably with his friend, Joseph Stevens.
Mm. There's so many good questions. And I know, I hope we have time for all of them, but how many Fitzhenry Lane paintings exist, and are they held in public institutions in the US?
Yes, numerous. I don't know the exact number, but we're talking dozens and dozens of paintings, and then this whole body of lithographic work that he's done, and then drawings. So I'm guessing the total corpus of work runs to the hundreds. They're in major collections throughout the country, and I think, you know, you can go to the Brooklyn Museum of Art and see one of the biggest paintings that he ever did, and you can go to the Fine Arts of San Francisco, Museums of San Francisco, and see one of my favorite small paintings by Lane, which is called Braces Rock, Braces Cove, or actually the Terra Foundation may have that picture, but he's represented widely throughout the world, really. And there is a painting by Lane at the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection in Madrid, Spain, which is one of the great collections of American art outside of the United States. So he's an artist who's extremely well represented, even if the name isn't a household name today.
Prolific. Sounds like really prolific. Someone is asking, would you have a slide or can you comment on a well-known painting of Blue Hill?
Yeah, so the Blue Hill painting, I have looked at it. I mean, this is the idea that I have for the exhibition, would be to bring together some of the work that's done around Penobscot, Penobscot Bay. And I know the Blue Hill image, but I can't bring it to mind at this minute. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that one.
It's okay. Resident, one of our curators, thank you for your approach of an object's biography and a wonderful narrative. How do you believe his lithography training may have influenced his working process and also his vision?
So that's, I think, something that Melissa Geisler-Trafton and Georgia Barnhill have really talked about beautifully in their study of Lane's lithographic practice. There's also a scholar named David Tatum who's looked at the way in which these lithographic publishing firms inspired a whole group of artists, including people like Winslow Homer, and trained them in draftsmanship and trained them in what's actually a very complex scientifically informed industrial form of reproduction. And Lane becomes very facile, as I think those drawings demonstrate, in transcribing the visual environment to linear form. So I think regardless of whether he was using camera lucida or camera obscura to produce some of those panoramic drawings, Lane has, as a result of his training both in Gloucester and in Boston, this facility with line and representation that he brings, and it's translated even into the fine details of the rigging of boats that you see in those large paintings. It's, I don't want to say effortless for him, because I think obviously it was hard-won skill, but Lane is an artist who is not afraid to draw and has great confidence in that. And I think that's communicated in most of the work from a very early point in his career, from the 40s. In his later work, he gets, I don't want to use the term impressionistic, but he gets looser with his brushwork. And there, I think he's giving himself freedom, greater freedom from his lithographic training as a young man.
Would you know if he ever painted on Monhegan Island in Maine?
I don't know that. I mean, it's possible. I'm sorry. I've tried to sort of equip myself with all the imagery around your region in mid-coast Maine, but I actually don't know whether Monhegan was his subject. We know he was up at Mont Desert. And he did at least one view of Portland.
Someone is interested in wondering if your exhibit will travel to Maine.
That would be nice. I think it probably would have an appreciative audience there. I haven't talked with Megan Pogue, the director of the museum, about that, but I have, like most curators, I have big ambitions for these shows, and I'd be happy if it went to Spain too. So it would be fun to see it have an audience in Maine, where I think people would recognize the sites, but also, I hope, become familiar with the challenges that an artist like Lane faced.
It looks like there's a question here from someone who's not American, but is wondering, how does Lane's work compare with Montague Dawson?
I'm sorry, Montague Dawson. I'm not familiar with that artist's work. There's a Dawson who worked in Giverny when I was the director at that place, but I don't think that's the same one.
I'm just looking through the questions again. I think we're lots of comments, and people are very appreciative. Yes, thank you. I don't think we've got any additional comments here. I'm just scrolling through. So I want to thank you, Dr. Cartwright, for your time, for your expertise, for this excellent presentation. I mean, so many folks are excited about your research and the connections that you're making, and it's just such a pleasure to have you here. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, and I really appreciate the feedback from the group that's assembled, and wish you all the best. Stay healthy.
Thank you. This concludes our program this afternoon. Please let us know how you liked it, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you again, Dr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Jude. See you soon.